Hey guys, it's Kat, and I wanted to do something a little bit different. A lot of you guys are wondering what my thoughts are about Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ezra Klein's recent interview, and I thought that I would actually do some sewing, listen to the interview while I'm doing that, and just come back and give you guys my sporadic commentary. I'm going to do very little editing on this. This is going to be in the style of the video notes that I frequently make for my members only for some of the projects that I'm working on. So if you do enjoy this video and you want to see me doing something like this for other things, join my members. That's how you can see some of those videos. I've done this now for a couple of my projects. But I wanted to make a video about this, but I also I want to be creative, y'all. I've been in this place right now where I'm just trying to enjoy my creative side and be a lot less plugged in. But I wanted to give my thoughts about this because I figured it would cover a couple of topics in one video. So yeah, I'm going to be working on a corset-y type thing that I made out of a pair of jeans. I made these shorts the other day. I know they're so sexy, right? And I have the other half of the jeans that I made the shorts with that I'm making into a corset. So yeah, that's kind of what I'll be doing while I'm listening to this. And I think I can get it done by the end of this video. So yeah, I will give you guys updates as I share my thoughts, but this is what we've got. This is the pieces all kind of laid out. I'm going to be putting some like boning and stuff in these. Oh yeah, I lost 2 of my nails. I know. But anyway, basically I'm just going to be sewing all this together. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing while I'm listening to this Ezra Klein interview. Judging from a lot of the people that I've seen who are talking about this right now, I kind of get the impression that Ezra Klein is going to be on some bullshit. And we are going to predicate this conversation by establishing that Ezra Klein is a Zionist. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You know, Zionism in its current form being this justification using the history of the Jewish people to justify why they deserve an ethno-state in Israel right now. So, you know, keeping that in mind as we have some of these conversations about where the Democrats should be going. And part of why I wanted to make this video, again, because it covers so many different topics, I've had a lot of people be very confused about my political position, and where I stand and how I feel about the Democrats. And I think people who've paid attention already know how I feel about this, but I am not a Democrat. I've never been a Democrat. Have I supported Democrats? Sure. Have I agreed with certain Democrats? Absolutely. Right. But I have never been fond of the Democrat Party. And I would say that that's probably one of my most consistent political positions. So all of that being said, one of the main reasons why I wanted to watch this is because I think it's going to open up a conversation about the Democratic Party. And it's especially going to open up some conversations about what the Democrats should be doing right now. Many people are under the impression that we should be pushing the Democrats more right so that they can get more votes and then gain more power. I personally think that we have enough evidence at this point to know that that is not actually a winning approach, but I think that that's an approach that we are going to have to tolerate a lot. Well, we're not going to tolerate it, but you know what I mean? We really shouldn't be tolerating it. But anyway. Okay, so I just started the video. I literally had just started watching the interview, and we haven't even been introduced to Ta-Nehisi Coates yet, and he's already saying something aggravating. So one of the very first things he says is there are 2 things that Donald Trump said at Charlie Kirk's service that were true. And one of those things being that Charlie Kirk did not hate his opponent. And, you know, let's just talk about Charlie Kirk. I know a lot of you guys have been curious about my extended feelings about Charlie Kirk. I think it says a lot about you if you listen to Charlie Kirk's message and you don't hear the hate. I actually think that Charlie Kirk has been a very, very, very interesting boiler point, because from where I'm sitting, right, Charlie Kirk was pretty overtly hateful. I would say I mostly knew of him because he was hateful, right? I would say that's the most pronounced thing about him. I would say that even in his death, what he was saying before he was shot was in the process of forming a very hateful idea. And what's been really interesting to me about a lot of the conversation we've been having recently is we've been talking a lot about literacy and our literacy level. And something that I genuinely did not understand is that a lot of people were functioning at a 6th grade literacy level. Now, why do I bring that up? In the understanding of Charlie Kirk, it's very clear that there are some people who, for one reason or another, cannot hear the hate in what he's saying, but they can't hear it because they don't hear the subtext, right? Like I said, before he was shot, he was starting to form a fairly hateful idea. That hateful idea being associating gun violence with Black people. Now, did he overtly say Black people are, violent inherently, yada, yada, yada? No. I mean, at least in this conversation, he didn't, right? But that is what he was saying. That is the image that he was trying to bring up. And there's a way that that's very obvious to me as a person who understands the context in which Charlie Kirk exists in. He is a descendant of the Rush Limbaugh sort of desire for the mainstreaming of conservative ideas, right? So obviously what he's saying is not disconnected from that, right? But there's a lot of people who genuinely don't see it that way. And I don't see it the way I see it because I want that to be the case. I'm literally reading it for what it is, right? And if you watch my video that I made about the rebranding of white nationalism, one of the things that I talk about is the fact that the way that they were going to mainstream white nationalism is by making it something that couldn't initially be seen as it, right? Plausible deniability is a huge part of that, right? And being able to, have movements that are, not as blatantly white supremacist, that is how you get to the more blatantly white supremacist movement, because you need a wider range of people to buy into these ideas. You need a wider range of people to say, well, you know what? Maybe Black people are inherently violent by their birth. Maybe Black people are inherently mentally inferior by their birth. And so then, through that dehumanization, you justify the idea of separating in a very clear way people on the basis of their race, and saying that this is an ethno-state that benefits the white man and the white man exclusively, right? Now, our country used to be very blatantly that, right? It used to just be blatantly that. But through the civil rights movement, we've been able to shift that. Charlie Kirk, who openly disagreed with the civil rights movement, is part of a legacy of people who are really just in these conversations to mainstream these ideas and undo the effect of the civil rights movement, right? That is what this is all about, right? So to say that Charlie Kirk didn't hate his opponent, I think, is very, very, very silly. It sort of demonstrates a lack of understanding, a lack of really having skin in the game. Because I think that the only way you're really able to feel that way is if you are not part of the group of people that he's attacking. Mind you, when I have straightforward conversations about white supremacy and the history of racism and the impact of racism, there are people who call me hateful, right? They call me hateful for speaking about white supremacy and the Kirk, who, but then you have Charlie Kirk, who, you know, just said some very hateful things. And somehow we can't call that racist, right? Donald Trump could say all of these crazy racist things. Haitians are eating dogs and cats and shit, right? But we can't call that racist, right? We can't call that racist. But it is racist when I speak about white supremacy. I'm keeping the issue alive when I talk about how the history of the past is still the history we're experiencing and forming right now, right? It's a dissonance. And I think that a lot of people showed who they were with their support of Charlie Kirk, because I actually think that some people revealed themselves in ways that I don't think they were necessarily intending to. There are several influencers right now who are being called out for attending Charlie Kirk's rally, right? They're getting called out because they are conservatives and apparently their audience didn't think that they were. And I think that that is just so funny, because how for some of the people, it's like, how could you not tell? It's almost always like the person who you think it would be, right? almost always. And yeah, it's interesting because some people are able to live these lives that are apolitical, where they never have to think about their oppression. Whereas there's people like me who, you know, I've been stockpiling my hormones, understanding that the government's going to take them away. I've been growing my own food, understanding that it's going to become harder for me to access. I've been doing a lot of shit because I know the government is coming for me, that my rights are about to be taken away, that I will likely be imprisoned for who I am, what I believe in, and how I feel. All of those things simply being largely about the fact that I deserve to be liberated, right? Right? All the shit that Charlie Kirk rattled against. I embody all the shit that Charlie Kirk rattled against, from being an empowered woman to being a trans person to being a black person to believing that I deserve the ability to speak at all, right? It's so silly to me how a lot of white people will play these games of like, well, you know, he didn't hate them. He just advocated for hate against them. He just advocated for a smaller space for them in this world, right? It's so annoying. And then the same people who say that will get offended when you say that they're racist. That is insanity to me, love. It is insanity. So yeah, Ezra Klein, I will say for the record, I know very little about him. Y'all should probably piece this together by now. I don't follow the mainstream. I don't, you know, I've probably many years ago heard one or two of his things. I couldn't tell you what they are. I used to listen to a lot of NPR, and you know, I'm sure he's been on there. He's got a very NPRian type voice. So I barely know who he is. I know very little about him. I know that he's a Zionist. I know that white liberals absolutely fucking love him, think that everything he has to say is so much more valuable than anything a person of color could ever say about anything. So I know that bare minimum, he is a voice that is valued in these conversations. And so really what I'm going to do eventually, we haven't even gotten to, we're like a minute in and I've already recorded 10 minutes of commentary, but like, I know that this is going to be one of those videos where I'm going to cover a lot of topics, and I wanted to get a lot of those themes out of there and so you guys know how I feel about that shit. Anyway, I need to... Okay, I'm back already. Also, side note, I'm gardening. So, you know, if my cucumbers start cucumbering, if my pickles start pickling, that's why, baby. But how did we get here? How did we get here? How did we get here? I'm back because I'm like, I get so annoyed with this. You guys want to ask how we got here. Do you know how we got here? You guys refuse to actually dismantle the system that maintains this. That's how we got here. That's how we got here, right? You want, like, how did we get to the point where a billionaire became president again after already being a felon? Because capitalism, man. I mean, I understand that for a lot of people that's not a satisfying enough answer, but it is what it is, right? Capitalism relies on exploitation. This is a country that, yes, slavery was abolished, but not really. Capitalism requires a slave class. It does. Capitalism in this country has always required a slave class. First it was black slaves, right? Then it was the incarcerated, right? Now it's immigrants and many of the people who are also incarcerated. And while I know people are going to watch these videos and be like, oh, you know, they're never going to bring back slavery in a real way. Yes, they are. Yes, they fucking are. When Donald Trump started to realize that a lot of this stuff was hurting farmers, one of the things he said was that maybe when ICE comes and raids these farms, they'll be able to go to the owner and he'll figure out what they can do, right? AKA opening up the doors for slavery, right? In a very real way. Because they need it, right? They need it. That is how all of this works, right? We produce way more food than we can eat in this country. We don't give it to the people who need it in this country. And then we suffer because of it, right? Like, all of this is flawed. But of course, we're never going to go there. We're never going to push for, say, a, you know, classless, moneyless society, so to speak, right? And so we're going to keep running into this. And liberals, right? Liberals are going to continue to help facilitate it. Liberals are going to continue to help facilitate it. And how do they do that? By laundering in right-wing ideas. Not even laundering. This is a country that is more right-wing than people recognize. And I'll say this because I was talking about this a lot before the election. I used to live in Orange County, as I've talked about many times on this channel. I was surrounded by conservatives for a really long time. That's all I knew. Conservatives, right? Let me fucking tell you, they are for sure more conservative than you recognize in this country. There are more capital C conservatives, and there are Democrats who are basically conservatives. This country is more of a right-wing country than not. Both the Democrats and the Republicans ultimately bow down to capitalism, which means they will bow down to AIPAC, which means that our country is controlled, right? It is not moving in step with the people, right? That is where we're at. And we're going to continue coming back to this spot as long as this is what it is. It's just going to keep happening over and over and over again. How do we know that? History. We see it over and over and over again, right? And all liberals want to do is maintain the status quo. And of course, that's a status quo where they're going to survive. But most of us are going to be on our own. Anyway, let's see how far. I'm going to let it play. I'm going to let it. So, okay. Ezra Klein is doing this thing that I made a video about this because it was fascinating to me to sort of observe this. Ezra Klein reveals, I think, something that a lot of people don't always assume of white people, right? Like, white people are often really afraid that people like me are going to assume that they're racist, right? And a lot of times, because of our propaganda, right, we are sort of encouraged to just fully not see anything they do as racist, potentially, right? Personally, for me, I've had a lot of moments where I've felt bad for assuming that someone was going to be racist only for them to be racist, and then me figure out, like, oh shit, I probably should have listened to my intuition there, right? There's a lot of people who I don't think are understanding that there's a lot of people who probably would not have assumed that you were a person who was so indifferent to racism that you actually not only mourn Charlie Kirk, but expect for Black people specifically to mourn him as well, right? That reveals a lot. And you know what? Here's the thing. You have to think about the way that these people have reacted to every other death, right? The horrible things that were said about George Floyd, right? George Floyd, may not have lived the most perfect life in the world, right? But he didn't go around basically justifying the premise of his death, right? And if he did, I think plenty of people would have had a very easy time saying, well, hey, I guess that's what you get. But then certain people demonstrate not necessarily glee, but indifference towards his death. And that is seen as some sort of crazy violation of a social code. And it's very fascinating because you really could argue that perhaps both of these deaths should be reacted to similarly, but we seem to really only give a lot of humanity to the white man. And this is a white man who not only was hateful, but said that certain people should die in order to protect the Second Amendment, right? Certain people should just have to die because of gun death in order for the Second Amendment to be maintained, right? And it's just one of those very interesting things where why are we expected to show sympathy and empathy and consideration to someone who wouldn't piss on us if we were on fire, right? Charlie Kirk may have been chummy with Candace Owens, right? He may have been chummy with certain tokens and people who, were able to justify the premise of his supremacy, right? But that doesn't mean that he loved people. That doesn't mean that he cared about people. That means that he was accepting to a certain type of person, right? And that's a very strange metric to use when we're trying to have a conversation about someone actually not being hateful. To me, it really does say a lot when someone doesn't notice how hateful he is. And I think it's strange to sit here and lecture a Black man about how to mourn the loss of a white man who did not value him, who would have cheered on his death. And it's interesting to me how Black people are always expected to be the bigger person, and white people are always sort of seen as, these innocent kids who couldn't, who maybe fucked up, but didn't deserve the thing they said they were okay with experiencing, right? It's very fascinating. Black people are always expected to be at this certain standard that white people are often seen as being not capable of reaching. Or if they couldn't reach it, there's a good explanation for why that is, right? Anyway, we have not gotten far into this video. Sorry, just kidding. I'm back. You worry that we're in a new cycle of political violence? This conversation about political violence is very interesting to me because what is political violence to you, right? How are we defining that? You could argue that political violence is, por ejemplo, people deciding to not offer accessible health care, right? You could argue that it's not having affordable homes, that it's landlords being able to continue to raise prices while offering very little, right? You could argue all of those things are violent, but of course we only see people being shot in their heads as violence, right? I get that. I understand why people differentiate these things, right? But I think what's frustrating about this conversation is that for a certain class of people, they never really have to feel it, right? They never really have to feel all the various little ways that these political shifts really affect people, right? Some people are just happy to maintain the status quo because it means that their life remains the same. And right now, during this administration, there are a lot of people who would otherwise not be impacted by this stuff that are indeed being impacted by this stuff, right? Political violence, I think, is going to look like a lot of women being forced to have child care. They don't have access to birth control or abortions or anything, right? It's going to look like young girls having few. You can see in this conversation that Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates just have two completely different vantage points. And that Ta-Nehisi Coates has a vantage point that is far more based in like reality and history, whereas Ezra Klein's is based in this sort of fantastic, what if maybe one day we could kind of way of looking at things. And it's not as if I don't understand why. It's not as if I don't understand why these people think this way, but it's aggravating because what I think Ta-Nehisi Coates is trying to get across is that we have a reason to feel the way we do. Black people have a reason to feel the way we do about this country, right? And frankly, you almost validate it by continuing to reinforce, frankly, the path that the Democrats have been on for decades at this point. Democrats have often argued that we need to be pulled more right, more right. Everyone needs to go more right, right? And at the end of the day, that means that you're going to move away from what the people want. You're going to move further and further and further away from what the people want and closer to what corporations want, closer to what billionaires like Donald Trump want, right? That's why we're in the position that we're in. To answer your first question, it's always going to end up going back to that. But I love that Ta-Nehisi Coates brings up the point that for Black people, we've always lived in a sort of political violence. And the fact that this is so scary to a lot of white people after Charlie Kirk's assassination does say a lot. You know, transparently, I've been threatened for the vast majority of the time I've been on the internet speaking about the things I speak about. And I'm never calling for violence. I'm never justifying violence. I'm never defending violence. But speaking of myself in a humanized way has caused me to experience violence. That is the reality of the position that we're in, where people like me have to fight for their humanity, where people like Ezra Klein, even as a Jewish man, are often granted their humanity, right? And it's aggravating mostly just because I think if we listen to each other, we can actually have a productive conversation looking at, but I don't think Ezra Klein is really listening. He just said that he thinks that sometimes painting the historical scope that wide is unhelpful, but like it is. It's helpful because it helps us see how we got here. He asks, why is Charlie Kirk winning? Charlie Kirk was winning for the same exact reason as Hitler was successful. I love that Ta-Nehisi Coates brings up the fact that sometimes hatred can be as strong, if not stronger, than love. I think a lot of times liberals like to believe this very like love wins out kind of thing, and I get why. But at the end of the day, you are believing in the goodness of people. A lot of these liberals who are Democrats, they believe in the goodness of people, and I don't think that's necessarily a catch Republicans. They can catch conservatives in hypocrisies, and then it's going to be this like, oh, you were hypocritical, you know, kind of situation, when the reality is these people know. They know that they're being hypocritical. They know that they're being hateful. They like it. And I think that a lot of liberals underestimate how much of an animating, you know, fact. So, okay, I want to address this point that Charlie Kirk went to these schools and did what he did to convince people and to do politics. Here's the thing. Ezra Klein is not wrong when he says that. The reason Charlie Kirk was on college campuses was to convince children, right? Charlie Kirk was part of a movement of people who, once again, were trying to get right-wing positions to be quite accepted, right? There was a certain point where they recognized that they did not have the youth. They needed to do outreach. That's when they started to invest heavily into things like Turning Point USA. And the purpose of things like that was to spread these ideas, right? So yes, he's not wrong in saying that he was doing that to do the politic. But Ta-Nehisi Coates is also very, very right, to point out that that's not all that was happening. These were being posted online. These videos were being posted online. They were monetized, and they were monetizing what often were people who were still forming their ideas being bullied, basically, right? Because I want to reiterate, Charlie Kirk was not a good debater. Charlie Kirk is a white man in a country that gives a lot of white men a lot of credit. And he also leans into very classic Christian concepts that are accepted by a lot of people. But just because you're leaning into commonly accepted ideas, just because your ideas are popular, just because people agree with you, does not mean that you're right, does not mean that you're actually a good argumentarian. It means that you are appealing to a lot of people's base understanding of things, right? Which, interestingly enough, is also the way that hatred is often formed. You appeal to people's base discomforts. Charlie Kirk is often talking to people who have just left their hometown for the very first time in their entire lives. For the very first time, they're out in the world engaging with people who are different from them. And it's really attractive to hear from someone like Charlie Kirk that all of these people are, for X reason or another, out to hurt them. I remember my first couple of years of college. People who've been following me for a really long time will probably remember my first years of college, right? I was a sheltered, paranoid person because I was raised evangelical and not really given a lot of opportunity to socialize with people who were not like me. And I definitely felt that, going away to college would put me in a lot of situations where, I would be exposed to things that I didn't want to be exposed to and all these other things, right? Charlie Kirk did what a lot of people do when they're trying to influence you. He latches to your base desires, right? Latches onto some very basic things, right? And I think the only thing I can really give him credit for is the fact that, yeah, he was good at it, but I don't think he was good at it in that he was actually right. He was good at it in that he understood how to appeal to people's base needs, right? I hate this idea that people, especially in my position, need to go out of their way to reach across the table, because we do that. We do that. We've done that. In fact, one of the things that I've been trying to talk about on here is I've done that most of my life. We still ended up in the position that we're in. And I'm in a position right now where I'm no longer really engaging with that, because now I understand that it's kind of a silly thing, right? There will always be people who want to oppress me because of how I am, because of who I am. It doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter how I act. They don't like me. They will never like me. And even if they do like me, they're often just liking me so that I can be used to hurt other people and, get them out of there, right? So at the end of the day, I don't really think we need to do all of that. I definitely think that there's something to be said about the way that people are dismissed, right? I think there is something to be said about, obviously people who are dismissed on the, and here's the thing that's a little annoying to me about this right now. Donald Trump is actively calling for violence against people on the left. Like, not even vaguely. They are gonna eventually try to go door to door to get everyone who doesn't politically agree with him, right? I think that if you are a person who is still entertaining the premise that that's not going to happen, you need to wake the fuck up. Seriously, wake the fuck up. Because I do think it's dismissive to say everyone who votes for Trump is a racist, but I also think that the reality of it is Trump is supporting this bullshit, right? That's the reality of it, right? And for a lot of people, the racism that he was promising to do was... Okay, I am slowly piecing things together, and I need to rethread my bobbin now. But he's on some bullshit, so let's talk about it. So right now, Ezra Klein is talking about, like, basically, did standing up for trans people and criticizing Democrats for supporting the platforms of openly transphobic people actually hurt actually hurt us. That's basically what he's saying. That's essentially what he's saying. And I am so annoyed. I feel like here's what we see right now. A lot of people didn't give a fuck then, and they certainly don't give a fuck now. Right? There were a whole class of people who basically said, you know what? Trans people are fucking annoying. You know? Like, I was fighting with a lot of people about Dave Chappelle, you know? Lots of people I was fighting with about Dave Chappelle. And when I say I was fighting with them about Dave Chappelle, I was basically, you know, trying to say, hey, yeah, he is actually saying some pretty fucking transphobic things. I'm not like a super easily offended person, but like, holy fucking shit, man. Can we acknowledge the fact that part of what he's saying is part of the dehumanization of trans people? And that dehumanization is something that will ultimately lead us to genocide. And I try not to talk about this because I know that this is one of my more negative opinions and I don't like to be depressing. But I really do think that we are going to see a genocide of trans people in this country. And I have really no reason not to feel that way. And part of why I feel that way, ironically, you know, in context to this conversation, is just the way that we've been talking about trans people, right? The Democrats have decided that trans people are a lost cause and that we actually need to be, and that Democrats actually need to be supporting transphobic ideas so they can gain power. I mean, Gavin Newsom has, you know, been rubbing shoulders with transphobes, and he's apparently going to be probably the person that people think is going to get us out of all this, right? Like that's the idea, right? And it's a little aggravating because the reason why I would call stuff like that out back then is because I recognize dehumanization as one of the main precursors to genocide. And if we can't even be humanized in a little context like a stupid comedy special, that says an awful lot, doesn't it? Right? You guys have to keep in mind all of the different shit that we've recently had to be censored around, right? You like people, Jimmy Kimmel's show got canceled because he made a joke about Charlie Kirk, right? Do you understand? Like, people are willing to move for some people and they're not willing to move for others. And one of the ways I feel my dehumanization is that I know that no one's going to care when I don't, you know, I know that whether the government murders me or some dude gets angry at me and kills me, people are going to defend my death. I know that. I'm confident about that. In fact, I don't think there's anything I'm more confident about. And that's a sad thought, but it's also kind of like, how else am I supposed to feel? You know, how else am I supposed to feel? That's the only evidence I have. All the evidence that I have leading up to this point says that at even the smallest moments, people aren't going to do anything to help, right? So to answer Ezra's question, or to really acknowledge his point about having a pessimistic view, how do you develop a positive, optimistic view when in even the smallest of circumstances, you're told that you shouldn't be caring about your humanization, right? What's interesting to me is Democrats want to throw minorities under the bus and run on throwing minorities under the bus, but they want them also to continue to be optimistic about the state of the country. It's as if we only exist in these conversations to serve, not to actually be protected, to serve. Or we're a bargaining chip, right? People say, well, we'll give the trans people their rights maybe one day. And it's like, you could just advocate for them. Oh, but that would fuck up our our whole thing. We really like these Republicans. We really, really like these right wingers. Okay, yeah. The more this goes on, the more nauseating it becomes. Like, this guy is killing me. He's answering his own questions over and over and over again, and he doesn't quite see it, right? So we're at the point where, we've gone a bit past it, but we were on the point where he was talking about basically how the polling on trans issues has always been really negative, right? And what do you do with that? Essentially, kind of saying, this doesn't really seem like a popular issue. Maybe Democrats need to move on from that issue, right? He's also now talking about how he's so surprised by people like Tucker Carlson suddenly becoming a white nationalist, and he's seeing all of this hatred become super loud and so obvious, and he's wondering, like, how exactly did we get here? How exactly did we get to the point where people are so hateful? It's because you build your coalitions around hate. Do you understand that fundamentally, if you are entertaining the idea that because the majority of people hate transgender people, you're going to turn a blind eye to or be dismissive towards their oppression? Like, you're literally building coalition through hate. That's why. And naturally, people are only going to get more and more and more and more and more hateful. That's how it happens. And it is really fascinating to me. He's talking about Holocaust revisionism. Watch my video again that I made about the rebranding of white nationalism, where I talk about Holocaust denialism used to be an incredibly unpopular idea. It was one of those ideas people knew they couldn't share, right? Now, you've got all these people who, through a very thin veil, tried to make it seem like they weren't, anti-Semitic. Now they're in a situation where they have more freedom to speak, and now they're finally starting to be openly Holocaust deniers, because they always were. And the way you stop this shit is by seeing that little bit of it and then calling it out. Like, that's the interesting thing about it, right? You guys, it's like, I understand why in small instances people don't think it's worth talking about. But you have to understand that the reason we talk about the small instances is because the big instances are made way with many small instances. We would not have gotten to a point where people are openly speaking about Holocaust denialism if we actually opposed the white supremacists who were trying to mainstream their ideas. Do you know how we got to that point? Reaching across the table, saying, hey, maybe we should listen to these white nationalists, right? Then those white nationalists reach thousands, millions of people. Their messages spread across the world, and they're able to organize and gather and realize that they too also have a group of people who are willing to defend and support them as Holocaust deniers, right? So it's a little aggravating because you actually could choose to defend people right now, choose to take on the unpopular position, like slavery, for example. It was unpopular at the time to liberate slaves, right? But here we are, right? You could choose to take the unpopular position that helps people, or you could choose to openly express pessimism towards their survival. Basically, what Democrats are doing right now is saying, I think it's a lost cause. They're throwing their hands up and saying, oh, you know what? I think it's going to go that way anyway, and we should actually just support it because that means we're going to get more votes, more power, right? I know that a lot of people didn't understand this at the time, but Kamala Harris would have been doing this exact thing. This is what happens with establishment politics, right? This is the natural result of it. The needs of the people are always put last Because at the end of the day, the only reason these people want to appeal to these people is so they can keep their cushy position in the government. Right? That's it. That's it. Whether it actually helps people or doesn't help people doesn't matter. All of this is for profit. So I messed up and I need to unpick some of this, but Ezra Klein's rejection of history, let me put you guys here while I unpick this, is really aggravating to me, because in this point of the interview, he's talking about how, the civil rights, basically, why do people keep going back to that? Like, that's a point in our history where people lost. Actually, it's really important that we talk about the Civil War, because big part of this, and you see, this is all kind of aggravating to talk about because I know no one actually cares, but we're seeing a lot of what we're seeing right now because the Confederates were not punished, and because the South will rise again. Like, if you look at a lot of this stuff, that's all this is, right? And so to ignore the history, I think, is just to muddy the waters. And it's really grating to me how he sounds like Ezra has like such a condescending kind of, patronizing tone, a tone that I'm super accustomed to hearing from white liberals. Have this way of making it seem like you are the scary, angry Black person who is irrational and unreasonable and, unwilling to work with others and this and this and that. And really what it boils down to is, no, you're actually just a lot less soothed by white supremacy, right? A lot of these dudes, they don't even see the bullshit that they expect for Black people to tolerate. They expect for Black people to tolerate so much. They want for Black people to tolerate outright disrespect, basically, so they could say that they did, And it's aggravating to me mostly just because they're always expecting, in whatever political scenario they're advocating for, to be the people who are comfortable. They never really want to quite be the uncomfortable ones in the conversation. You know what I mean? They never quite want to be that person. In whatever future they're advocating, they are making sure that they're comfortable. And that's really what Ezra Klein seems predominantly concerned with, offending white racists, basically. It's the same shit that I've heard all my life. Like, stop assuming every white person is racist. And, like, that is being treated as such an important thing, like, so much more important than, my civil rights. It's really aggravating. Because, again, it reveals this sort of, like, spoiled brat kind of thing that a lot of white folks just have. Like, why do you feel so comfortable with people being oppressed? Why do you feel so comfortable with people not getting the things they need? Why? Why are you so comfortable with some of us dying? Why are you so comfortable with certain people being genocided if it means you get to win? That's kind of what's beneath a lot of this. And I think what he's not registering is it's what people have asked of Black people forever. Like, if Black people start enslaved again, like, race becomes a measurement for who is and isn't a free person in this country in a very real way, right? Basically what they're asking us to do is kind of like tolerate that, so that maybe one day they can go back to, the way things used to be for them to be comfortable. It's like, I don't think they really get, like, what they're asking for. And that's kind of what's aggravating to me about a lot of this. Like, it's okay for us to experience it. But the moment you start to, it's too much. Listen to, and I just keep going back to the fact that if people were listened to, we probably wouldn't be even having this conversation at all. Oh my God. Ezra Klein responding to Ta-Nehisi Coates' point about Martin Luther King and how when you've seen how you can advocate for nonviolence and even love and still be shot in the face, and how that would maybe engender you to be a little bit less optimistic about the direction of the country, being a goddamn Buddhism quote is so perfect, right? It's such a perfect little encapsulation of the way that like people use religion to be dismissive of like tangible realities, right? Like the reality here is that Ta-Nehisi Coates is describing the very real way that many of us have just been living, right? Like we've just been living this way, with this awareness of the fact that we could potentially be harmed for who we are and being free, right? And because we know that that's a possibility and we see the way that it's mocked, again, George Floyd, right? That doesn't really engender a lot of confidence in the country, right? And the fact that he just said that is just so, it was too perfect. It was like, dude, come on. You have to understand that what you're doing here is being dismissive towards the tangible reality of what Black people experience. And the thing is, you know, all of this conversation feels predicated on this idea that Ta-Nehisi Coates is just negative. He's just negative. You know, white people love to do this thing when we're having conversations about racism where they're like, but why do you choose? Why do you choose to feel that way? Why do you choose to have a reaction to it in that way? And the reality is, you don't really give people reasons other than, you know, that to feel that way. Like you choose to, instead of listening to them, you choose to dismiss them. You choose to negate everything about what they're doing and saying purely so that you can like feel good. It's crazy. That's all he wants in this conversation is to feel good. That's it. That's it. Doesn't matter what the reality is. He just wants to feel good. And what he says is so aggravating. He says he wants to be a politically curious person exploring his political something or other during political peacetime. Privilege. And, you know, it's aggravating because, yeah, it's, you know, I think a lot of these conversations are very productive and interesting and good to have. I don't want to make it seem like I don't believe that we should talk about this stuff. I do think we should talk about this stuff. But also, at the end of the day, you're talking about it from a vantage point that gives you a lot of distance from what we're talking about. You know, for you to talk about trans people, so like, oh, you know, so what do we do about them? What do we do? You know, I don't think a lot of people understand how gross that is. I really don't. I don't think a lot of people understand how gross that is. Ta-Nehisi Coates will leave this conversation a Black man. It's a little aggravating to me just because, like, I think that a lot of white folks, they end up spending this time advocating for why we should have these, you know, political conversations. But then there's a huge swath of them who operate from this perspective of being apolitical, right? How many white people do you know who are apolitical that posted about Charlie Kirk, right? They get to be apolitical in almost every other context. And then when they vote for politicians who want to genocide us, somehow we're wrong for not wanting to welcome them into the tent. It's kind of crazy. You know, it's privileged to feel like your life is not at risk in that context. You know, and I think that a lot of people don't understand that for a lot of people, that really is what it boils down to. The fact that their life is at risk. That if they were to let you into their tent, you may kill them. And I think people can change. I want people to change. I want for Trumpers to not be Trumpers. Let's not get it fucked up. But I also think there needs to be an understanding of the actual pain. And I think so much of what Ezra Klein says would be more understood if he actually understood the violence, right? If he actually really understood that what we're talking about here is not just people being offended or whatever. We're actually having a conversation about harm, about danger, about very real dangerous things that hurt people. And so, yeah. So now we're at the part where he starts talking about how we need to have more left-leaning pro-life people. And I'm so happy that Ta-Nehisi Coates points this out to him, because part of what I hate about this strategy the Democrats are trying to run right now is you want to say that people are being fatalistic. You want to say that people are being pessimistic because they feel a certain way about the state of this country and your current interaction with them. What you're not recognizing is that your approach of leaning into the right and not doing what the people want is the actual position of pessimism here. You've decided that women's issues are a lost cause in the South. So there's no reason to run pro-life candidates in the South because, you know, all them people down there, them some hicks anyway, huh? That, you know, that's kind of the ironic aspect of it too. People are assuming so much of the people down there, right? As Ta-Nehisi Coates points out, reproductive rights are popular in the South, right? And I think what a lot of Democrats are not really calculating is right now you are running on the position of essentially trying to be a Republican, but like a light Republican. That is exactly what Kamala Harris did. That is exactly the kind of campaign that Kamala Harris tried to present as the one that would save America, right? And people voted for Trump. Why? Because when given the choice between a kind of sort of Republican and an actual Republican, the kind of people that want to get a beer with their candidate, which is a stupid metric for, you know, a politician, but whatever, they're just going to go with the Republican who says what they mean and doesn't pussyfoot around it, you know? And I'm sorry, but that's what it is. And it's aggravating to me because the pessimism in this position is that you could choose to entertain the idea that there are actually quite a few people that do indeed want for you to protect trans people. You could buy into the idea that there are quite a few people who do recognize, even on the right, that women losing reproductive rights is going to destroy a lot for women in this country, right? But instead, and this is what aggravates me, you make it seem like it's their idea, right? When really it's yours. And that's the thing I wish these people would just say. I wish Ezra Klein would just straight out say, and maybe he is in this video, that he thinks trans people are not worth advocating for because their rights are a losing issue for the Democrats, right? Demonstrations, and they're already showing that they're backing away from a lot of this, right? But just say that, right? Like, because here's the thing. What would the people criticizing you for not doing that be criticizing you for? They'd be criticizing you for being transphobic and for not calling it out when it needs to be called out, right? So you get elected and then you're just going to do the thing. You're going to, you know, because you ran on it, right? You ran on removing trans people from the bathroom and from, you know, giving them access to healthcare, right? So now you're just a transphobic Democrat, right? What's the point? What's the point? You know, like the way he's talking about this, he's trying to present like, okay, I think we should go in this direction, but I don't really feel this way. And I think in order for us to gain political power, maybe we should do some hateful bullshit. And it's like, why not just do the hateful bullshit and say that you want to do the hateful bullshit? Why pretend that it's political strategy when it's just how you feel? Right? Like, sure, did the Republicans probably buy into some bullshit they don't really believe because it was useful to them, and so's donating such and yeah, probably. But most people who are trying to vote are actually trying to not vote, not going to want a person, and the people who don't want a Republican are probably not going to want to vote for someone who is moving like a Republican. So why are you trying to move like a Republican, acting like that's going to help? Acting like that's going to be a sales point, right? When in reality, people who are going to vote for you are probably going to be voting for you because you're not a Republican, right? Why not just choose to not do the shit the Republicans do? Oh, it's because the Democrats do the shit the Republicans do. They just think they're different and have tricked a lot of people into buying into that bullshit. But that's another video for another day. Anyway, we are getting closer and closer to the end of this. My corset is only slightly more put together because I have been unpicking it for most of the time I've been watching this. But I do have all these panels laid out, and I've decided that I'm going to do just an underbust situation instead of like the whole thing I was going to do. So it's going to be like a sort of cincher situation. So we'll see how that goes. Also, I haven't poked holes in anything before, or I haven't in a really long time, and I think I might avoid doing that just to maybe keep it. I really love what Ta-Nehisi is saying about basically the callousness of the way that Ezra Klein speaks, because this is an issue that I have with a lot of people, right? So Ezra Klein, in this interview, he makes the point about how we need a pro-life Democrat in certain southern states, right? And then he walks it back a little bit, but then ultimately says, yeah, that is what he wants, right? He wants that to happen. And in the conversation, he's making the point of basically saying, maybe we do need to turn our backs on people who are in need of, reproductive rights in these areas so that we can gain political power. And then the fact that he kind of like flippantly says, oh, well, that's not exactly like the only example or like the main example. Yeah, that is demonstrating a degree of callousness around the tangible, very real harm people are going to experience. And it's something that I always feel in these conversations. It's like people are talking about this, but they have such a distance from it. They don't really hear what they're saying, right? It is a pretty big deal to be a person who is in a area where you need access to reproductive care and it's illegal, right? Like, it's a pretty huge damn deal. And it's aggravating to me that a lot of times the people who are given these platforms, the people who reach these people, quite frequently, they have no connection to it at all. And then when people who do have connection to it have conversations, people don't want to listen to them because they think they're too close to it, right? It's so frustrating. It's so very, very frustrating. And I'll say this, through this video, I am incredibly frustrated with Ezra Klein, because he just has this way of he says these things, and I'm not going to say that he's not an intelligent guy. He clearly is, right? But he says these things in a way where it's just like, why did you say that? Why did you say that? Why would you say that? Why are you so comfortable saying that? Like, why are you so comfortable flippantly speaking about trans people, flippantly speaking about, access to reproductive rights for people in areas where it's very complicated for them to gain access to it, right? Like, why is it always sort of seen as a chore for certain people to speak thoughtfully about folks in these conversations? It's a little aggravating to me, and I wonder why it is such a common thing. Like, I don't think that the Democrats really understand that there are a lot of us who, will vote for Democrats in certain contexts, but like, if you're making a point of basically saying you don't give a fuck about our survival, it's pretty easy for us to go a different way too. And that's something that's always stood out to me, because I've noticed that there's always this fixation on pursuing what a lot of people perceive to be the most valuable group of people. And it's always going to be white people living in middle America, many of whom have more conservative ideas. This is the conversation that we were kind of having in on the Why is Left Tube So White conversation I was having many years ago, where it's just so fascinating to me that of all the conversations that we have, it's always this sort of fixation on centering the white middle class. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't talk about the white middle class, like, let's not get it messed up, but it's strange to me how that is always seen as like the focus, the point. All right, so this is where I'm at with the corset. I've been battling with it for a bit now. It is coming together though. I am trying to sew this lace on the very bottom. And so I thought I would come and continue my thoughts. So I did finish the entire interview, but I will say that my strong feeling that I'm walking away with after watching that interview is that there's really no reason for me to participate in a lot of these conversations anymore. Here's the thing. One of the things that's overwhelmingly like aggravating to me about Ezra Klein and people like Ezra Klein, you know, and these Democrats in general, they always want to hold out for a future where someone like me isn't experiencing oppression, but it's never quite time to advocate for that. Like, there's never quite an appropriate or correct time. That it's always not the right time, you know? And you guys have to understand again that I feel this conversation in multiple ways, you know? I know that a lot of people hate when I talk about this or reference this, but I am a Black trans woman, right? And no matter how many people want to make the argument that this isn't the case, all of those things are used against me. All of those things are used as validations for my dehumanization. And I have felt that through my entire life, you know? And it's aggravating because from liberals to conservatives, right? Everyone basically believes that because I'm not currently enslaved, I should essentially just be thankful for what we have. And I hear where you're coming from with that to some degree, but it's crazy to me how people don't want to recognize, you know, when you advocate against protecting people like me, you really lose your leverage. You know, like when you're saying to me as a Democrat in 2025 that trans causes are worth discarding so that you can secure power, you are solidly telling me that you are not on my side. In a strong way, and it's in a very solid way, right? And all you have that's making me want to vote for you at this point is that you're not the other guy. And, you know, most of the times I've voted, that's how I've voted. Basically, I just don't want the other guy. I think it's really important to point out that whether Democrats are in power or Republicans are in power, there's always this pressure to placate to the right. And I think the reason why that is because, as I said, this country is more right-leaning. If you reject that idea, let me ask you this, right? Why is it that whether the Democrats are in power or the Republicans are in power, we're always supposed to keep in mind the white people in middle America who probably don't want for me to have civil rights, right? I think that should be evidence of where this country truly lies. And it is a little frustrating to me that so many people want to debate it, because I don't know how you don't see it at a certain point. Like, at a certain point, how do you not see that if this country were left-leaning, if it were leftist, right, we would not be having these conversations. Like, flat out, we wouldn't be talking about how we need to run a pro-life Democrat, right? Because running a pro-life Democrat would seem like a losing strategy in a more left-leaning country. But for a lot of Democrats, they see it as a winning strategy. So that should tell you where we actually stand as a country. That at the end of the day, because of capitalism, more people are right than left. And really, when people vote for the Democrat, they are still voting for a more right-leaning candidate than not. That's the limited imagination that this country has had, right? There are only two sides. You got to pick one. And of these two sides, both of them support capitalism, want capitalism to continue to thrive, and therefore, there will always be an underbelly of the oppressed. Always. We are never going to reach that point of utopia that, you know, a lot of liberals have in their mind, because inequality would no longer exist, and we need inequality for capitalism. Like, that's the reality of it. Like, we need inequality for capitalism. And people who want to act like, you know, every time we talk about this, there's always people that are like, well, show me a functional socialist country. Show me a functioning capitalist country, right? If you think it's working, that's probably because you were in a position of comfort in this society, right? But in every culture where capitalism thrives, exploitation thrives. That is the reality. You can't have one without the other. And I understand why people don't want to see it a different way, but like, that is the reality that we're currently in. That what's happening, what we're going to see happen, is immigrants are going to be taken off the streets, put into camps, used as workers. And that's important because, you know, a lot of Trump's buddies were using immigrants for low-paid labor, right? But they still had to pay them. Slavery basically would say that because of someone's lack of citizenship, right, to this country, they don't qualify as human beings enough to have rights. That's, you know, it's aggravating because that is the thing most people should be able to understand from the lesson of slavery, right? That part of how we get to slavery is dehumanizing people and explicitly stating that they are not citizens. That's part of the 14th Amendment, right? Like, that's part of all of this shit, right? That's part of why they're trying to get rid of it, right? They want to create a class of people who are dehumanized and therefore can be used for labor. That is the reality that we're in. That's not my opinion. That's not my conspiracy theory. It is the history of this country. And it is aggravating when people like Ezra just kind of don't want to engage with that, because really, if they did, and obviously, like I said, Ezra Klein knows a lot of this shit, right? Which is part of, I mean, Ta-Nehisi pointed this out during the interview, but like, it's kind of weird a little bit that you can have such verbose conversations about slavery and ism and all these other things and race in America, but then you really don't see it here. Because paying attention to Black folks, right? Like, what a lot of people didn't understand about Black Lives Matter and all the stuff that was happening when, you know, that was a trending conversation and everyone was talking about it, is that that is a conversation about dehumanization. It's a conversation about how the cops view Black bodies, right? How the cops look at Black people and say, you know, basically, you're not worthy of protection. You're not worthy of humanity. You know, I was watching this video the other day. I watch a lot of body cam videos and such. I shouldn't, but I do. And it was this white woman who had just killed her family. Her entire family was just murdered, right? And during the arrest, this was a woman who was older in age. She was probably in her 50s or 60s, I want to say. Because she's an old white woman, right? She's imbued with this humanity that allows her to, even after killing her own children, walk up to police officers and touch them in a very patronizing kind of way. You know, she gets to slip into that role of mom, that role of grandma, Mima, etc., right? And Black people are just monsters that should be shot on sight. That's why it was such an issue, because that's why people go down the list of like, oh, they were an honor student, yada, yada, yada. Because at the end of the day, that shit shouldn't matter. But in our white supremacist country, it certainly feels like it should. One of the things that I think is important to bring up in this video is that there have been 3 murders that have happened since Charlie Kirk was murdered in the name of Charlie Kirk. There is a murder where apparently this girl had made a joke about Charlie Kirk's death, and this guy went and killed her. Apparently he'd been stalking this girl. Apparently this guy was stalking this girl, and he saw that girl had made a joke about Charlie Kirk's death, and he went and murdered her along with, I believe, her friend. 2 Hispanic teenagers were murdered by a man who was were murdered by a boy that was stalking them, right? In the name of Charlie Kirk. Now, we always have these conversations about influencers not necessarily being responsible for the actions of their audience. And I, as a person who posts videos on the internet, definitely understand why we say that. But it is it's telling to me, right? It's telling to me that people could watch Charlie Kirk, hear what he's saying, and not see the direct line of violence, and then even in this circumstance would struggle to understand it, right? There was a hanging recently, and this was a lynching. The man's name is escaping me right now. I believe his name is Trey. I'll put his name in the actual video when I edit this, because I feel bad about not remembering his name. But it was initially dismissed as a hanging, suicide, which obviously sounds very suspicious to the people in Mississippi, because, there's a history of lynching, which means that, Black folks don't really, A, want to hang themselves, and B, leave their hang bodies to be discovered, right? So it was kind of odd that, that was apparently what happened. Come to find out, Trey's sister had made a joke about Charlie Kirk, right? And that had led to her being harassed by a group of white men. That group of white men, and there was an independent autopsy done, I believe, by Colin Kaepernick. He funded it. And it was discovered that, of course, it was not a suicide. That in Mississippi, a state with a long history of that, it was just a lynching. And this is one of many stories happening across the country right now. And as we are talking about this, we've got a president who is eagerly encouraging his people to go and attack people on the left. You know? They're trying to suppress the FBI statistics about right-wing violence, despite the fact that the guy who shot Charlie Kirk was a conservative, from a conservative family. It's apparently laid at the feet of the left, right? And I just think that it's really important for people to not lose sight of what is actually going on here. What's actually going on here is that Charlie Kirk inspired a lot of violence. And we're, I think, just seeing the very beginning of it. Charlie Kirk is like Jesus to some of these people. And I really do wish I was exaggerating. I really do. Charlie Kirk is being worshipped by Trump and his ilk, right? And to me, that is quite damning. And it's not telling me something I didn't already know. You know, I expect nothing less from these people, but it's fascinating to me the way that happens. And a lot of people want to act as if, you know, it's not par for the course, right? Like, it's so strange when Black people are attacked on the street by the cops and they resist, right? It's often seen as irrational. White man can make tons of content, you know, talking about how he believes that a consequence of having the Second Amendment is stuff like that happening. Something like that happens, and people still die. People still die. You know? You would think that we would be able to say, oh, you know, well, he said it, and that's, you know, you want to be, you know, you want to be responsible for the things you said, right? Like, and you said that this was okay, so here we are. But like, it's just, I'm baffled by the amount of freedom white people are given to be flawed and to say fuck that. Okay, in all honesty, I am probably not going to be able to finish this today. I mean, we got real close, but my sewing machine, my sewing needle just broke, and you know, I probably shouldn't rush through this, and also this isn't the point of this particular video. But when I do finish this, I will probably post it on my Instagram, so everyone should go follow me on Instagram if you want to see how this particular corset turned out. This is actually my very first corset. The very first time I've ever tried to add ribbing to anything, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I'm proud of it nonetheless. But anyway, oh, and also I lost an additional nail in the process of this. Oh my God. I just wanted to make a video that was a little bit different about this. I definitely am over engaging with stuff like this. I wanted to make this video because I wanted to experiment. I also wanted to share some of my thoughts. I think we covered a lot of ground. I am currently in a position right now where I'm kind of divided about what you guys want from me. On one hand, I have a lot to say about all the things that are happening right now. On the other hand, I feel like I have been saying that stuff for years and years and years. And so I have some topics, some things that I want to talk about, some, you know, interesting conversations, but honestly, it sort of feels like a moot point in so many ways at this point. And so, you know, I do want to spend more time being creative. So I'm going to try to do a lot of that. Maybe I'll show more of that on my page. But I wanted to just make this video and share my thoughts because I felt like it would be important to hear. So anyway, on that note, I will talk to you guys later. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you to all of my Patreon members, including the 3 people that you see on the screen right now. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate everyone for watching this video. I know this was a very different kind of experimentally video, but you know, if you're introspective and hot, I think you'll appreciate it. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much for watching.